we're choosing rather relentlessly a form of avoiding reality as it is.
You're listening to the Everyday Legends podcast, the show that is dedicated to helping everyday men build legendary relationships with yourself, your partner, and your world. I'm your host, Mike Campbell, and the aim of this podcast is simple: to help you navigate life with more clarity, more confidence, and purpose-driven action, with plenty of stories, a load of lessons, and some loving straight talk. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Legends podcast. If you're listening to this just after release, then hey, welcome back. And thank you for welcoming me back. Yes, I've taken a couple of months away from this as my wife and I and our little Baba Kaya relocated from Australia to New Zealand for some time. That meant packing our home, all of our stuff. That meant spending some time in quarantine. And then coming back to New Zealand and reconnecting with family and actually having our family meet our little baby, which was the biggest thing that happened for us in 2020 inside the COVID world, of course. No one could travel, all that kind of stuff. So I needed to take a break from the podcast as we relocated, as we settled, as we figured out all of the things in this slightly new reality that we now have. But I couldn't wait forever. I have a very cool guest today and a bunch lined up. I'm really, really excited to get back into it. There's plenty happening for me this year, so really, if you're a fan of my work, if you're a fan of the podcast, my content, and the people that I have on, then stay tuned. Click, like, subscribe, all of those things to make sure you get the notifications. Send this shit to your friends. Enroll them in listening to and consuming this stuff so you can talk about it and share and learn and anchor your learnings and have discussions about, I heard this point, what did you take from that? Interesting, I heard this point, da-da-da. When we discuss the kind of stuff that we're learning with others, it not only helps us anchor our learnings, but we hear things differently when we share them, and we hear totally different viewpoints and perspectives when they are shared with us, and we can have discussion about it and break things down and understand them with greater depth and greater understanding. That's what this work is about. You know, it's one of the things that I see so many men struggle with. I want more for myself. I want to get more from my life. I want to understand myself more. You know what? I just don't want to feel and experience all the punishing, painful, frustrating shit that I experience a lot of the time. I want to experience more. I want to be more fulfilled. I want to have more clarity. I want to feel comfortable with who I am, at peace in my skin. I want to feel grounded and fucking solid. Well, guess what? That shit doesn't happen on an island, an isolated island, brother. It happens in community. But often we're so terrified of appearing that we don't have all of our shit together. We are so terrified of appearing that I don't know, that I've failed, that I'm weak or useless or not capable or not competent, by simply sharing that I'm working on myself in some capacity, or actually talking about some of this stuff, asking for questions of people who might have answers, because then I have to admit that I don't know, and then I don't have the answers. I mean, that's a giant cockblock for your entire life right there. Now, this came from a little idea of, hey, share with someone that you're listening to this podcast. Anchor and reaffirm your learnings. Be an intelligent, curious discussion about them. But be okay with working on yourself, with wanting more for yourself and your family and your relationships. And invite people, men that you care about, brothers, friends, mates, colleagues, cousins, sons, fathers, into your world. They might not be into it. Maybe. Slowly drip some seeds. You might find this podcast interesting. It's pretty simple stuff. But we often think that we need to jump to the other end of the spectrum. I need to immerse myself in some kind of guruship and have everyone drink the Kool-Aid with me. That's not what this is about. But to the major point, we can struggle as men. Not just to ask for help. You know, it's a cliche now, but it's still true. But to simply let people into our worlds. We are so terrified often of having our shit seen that we hide it and hope that we will be seen and acknowledged and appreciated for the curated versions of who we put out into the world. That doesn't work, can't work, because we are never truly seen. Therefore, we don't ever feel seen because of that fucking absolute terror we feel around actually being seen and judged as all those things, fill in the blank, weak, useless, etc., not good enough. But it's that shit that we get to work on. And so it's my great privilege to announce here, sneakily, very quickly, a peek behind the scenes. I'm working on a brand new course, and it is called Get Your Shit Together 101. And it is a punchy, snappy, do-it-yourself, do-at-home course for men who want to, wait for it, get their shit together. You will hear on this podcast very soon when that's being released, how you can get the first access to it. The spots will be limited to start with in the first run. So you'll find out all about that very soon because as we've discussed, it can be daunting and challenging, and we get all these stories and justifications on all our shit gets in the way of us working on our shit. So this course is going to allow you to step gently yet significantly into that work and getting your shit together. At which point, perhaps then, we can develop the courage to do it in a more community-based, support-based, challenging, and accountability-based environment. But first of all, you can get some resources to dive into this stuff yourself. That's coming out soon. Keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you want to learn more about it and get to the very front of the queue to get the first spot or one of the first spots in that course, then send me an email, mike@mikecampbell.com.au. With all of that said, hey, we're here for an episode of the show. I'm super excited about this episode. I'm not going to do too much of an introduction because I think listening to this gentleman, you will get what you need. I am very excited to share with you that I have a man on the show today called Rainier Wylde. He is a mutual friend of a few of my friends, and it seemed to be a tipping point of having him being on my friend's podcast and hearing about him and recommendations and also consuming his content and being a big fan of what I see from him, that I needed to have him on the show. He dives into some amazing content in this episode today. We explore, authenticity and like finding your essential self. But one of the things I wanted to put to him was there's this popular, yet I think completely flaky and vague term out there in the personal development world called live your truth. So Rainier explores that and we break it down. And we also explore initiated and uninitiated masculine. And so essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at the process of initiation in men, in boys, what that's about, why we do it, what we're missing, what that used to look like, and potentially how we can come back to that. Rainier is an experienced teacher, writer, and speaker. He has embraced life for all that it is. He's celebrated its highs, learnt from its lows. He's managed a Fortune 500 company and built businesses. He's also elegantly blown them up, burned them down, and started all over from scratch. Through the various positions he has held, he has discovered that life must be claimed to hold any worth. His work is to inspire others to live fully and deeply in the here and now. And so, faithful listener, here is Rainier Wylde. Rainier Wylde, welcome to the Everyday Legends podcast.
Whew, thank you, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
It's a joy to have you here. I have, seen a lot of your content. I've read a lot. I've heard a lot. I've seen you and heard you on, friends' podcasts and heard about you from mutual friends, which is beautiful. And I was reflecting just before the call started. I think you're the first person I've had on my show that I haven't actually met, or at least had a conversation with prior. So, for example, we have a mutual friend, Dallas. I haven't really met Dallas, but it's a nice way to get to know someone. I think we take this conversation potentially in many very varying tangents. So, mate, where I want to start is this. First of all, you're good with my accent?
I'm great with it. I can understand 93% of everything you've said so far.
I'm pretty sure I've got, I know the words that just don't really land in America, and I go, oh, there's my Kiwi accent, fully hectic. Okay, so I'm learning a bit more about you, and some of my audience might know a hell of a lot more about you than I do, but also some might not. So where I want to start with is a little bit of, maybe a simple, maybe a very deep, esoteric question, and that is, who are you?
Uh, Mike, I dread this question every time someone asks it of me. I really do. In part because there's this world of Instagram or this world of coaching or self development, or I think performative culture in general,
Mm,
that talks about the mask, the mask we wear, the mask we want to be known for, the mask we want other people to see. And we get taught how to make these elevator pitches,
hmm,
like, uh, hi, my name is Rainier Wylde, and I help people who are redheads get out of ambiguous spaces in navigating their own elevator speeches. And I do this by providing a short, right? I mean, there's a formula to these kind of things. And I'm so resistant to wanting to talk about it. So
mm,
let me just
mm,
pause and think, how do I really want to answer that question? Well, I'm a father. I've got 4 children, um, ranging from 16 years old to 7. And they're all on the cusp of turning a year older right
mm,
now. And my oldest is now driving, which is a horrifying
mm,
sight. And my youngest, we're taking the whole family on a vacation to Hawaii, which is their first time traveling by plane anywhere. And it's certainly their first time going anything like overseas or to the
mm.
islands. And this is literally going to melt their minds. And my 7-year-old looks at me the other day and he says, I'm so excited to go to Hawaii. Finally. I looked at him and said, I was 37 before
Yeah.
I went to Hawaii. What do you mean, finally, kid? So, first of all, I'm a father, and this brings me a lot of joy and a lot of sorrow.
Hmm,
And I'm sure it brings them that as well. I have been a husband 2 times over, successfully divorced, and then successfully remarried. Numerous other times, almost been divorced and probably had to remarry. The other night, I looked over at my partner, who, after a decade of weathering a number of storms, I looked over at her and she looked up at me and she said, with glistening, moist eyes, I marry you, I marry you, I marry you. And aren't those just the most beautiful words in the world when you've seen someone's face every morning for 10 years and you still choose to marry them
mm,
all over again? And so I'm a partner, ill equipped still, but learning how to be so. Um, I'm a tinkerer of words. I think sometimes about my skills or abilities. I know my weaknesses largely, as much as anyone can know them. I have a lot of deficits, but I know a lot of them.
mm,
I tell you, I know the skills I have too. And one of the things that occurs to me sometimes is that I do occasionally know how to string words together, to daisy chain them together. A lot of boys learned how to change a tire as kids. A lot of boys learned how to
mm,
maybe change the oil or play a sport. And my parents, they weren't like that. I grew up as the child of a televangelist traveling
mm,
through the United States, saving the world for Jesus, one big tent revival at a time. And I grew up as a little boy idolizing my father and my uncles and my mother and my grandfathers, who were all preachers,
mm,
all evangelical fundamentalist Christian preachers, which meant that they're the last true orators on the planet who actually believe in Greco-Roman style oratory. And I grew up listening to these voices. And so what I learned was daisy chaining words together to form a thought. And so sometimes that comes out. And I guess I'm just looking for another story to tell, because I think if I tell my stories, other people start to tell theirs, and there's
mm,
something like healing. Those are things that occur to me to say right now. I think I'm also someone who has failed an awful lot. And most of the
mhm,
stories that I tell about my life are the stories that I'm the punchline of my own joke. because those are the best kind anyway, the kind that make the most sense to me, where I learn something at the end, and maybe we all do if we step into it.
Yeah, well, we can
So
connect
I
to
think
you,
I'll just
perhaps.
leave it there, but
So beautiful. Thank you for that. The daisy chaining of words. I can only but imagine, what you witnessed and what you learned and what you absorbed through that journeying clearly around as a child, and not just learning the art of obviously bringing words together, but telling stories, engaging people, and I suppose the importance of having a voice. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. And even as I'm hearing you say that, I was a little unfair to your audience in that moment, because I didn't say the real question of like, what do I do? So if I
Oh, don't
do
worry. I was going to
something,
get there.
what I seem to do is I seem to be always finding my own voice, which is something like helping others find theirs. And so across the last 20 years, I have done so many different things to help draw out others' voices: spiritual director, psychotherapist, graduate school professor, pastor, a number of different things, coach. These days, I don't know if I characterize myself as any of those things. Sometimes I've said I'm a bit of a bell, like a morning bell ringing, waking people up. And I do think that is actually what happens, whether or not I'm trying, whether or not I'm getting paid, whether or not I'm waking up saying that's my job. I seem to have the unique effect of, as I communicate something, people begin to wake up to something more of themselves. They begin to find their own voice. And one person recently said something I thought was very beautiful. She said, "You're a creative. You are the process of creativity. And how you see yourself is something like shattering all of the formulas that keep other people from finding their own way of creating the moment, moment by moment by moment." And I think that's right. So that's really what I do, I think, and so much of who I am. So I love that you said the voice that maybe I've found that helps other people find theirs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing that most definitely. And so then in that, something that you touched on right at the start was, um, in response to the question, who are you? There is, potentially this, well, look, there's who I present myself as in a sense of the Instagram world we live in. But then you also, I will call it, admitted to some real resistance around even coming to answer that question. What do you think that is?
Mm. Let's get me on the couch, Mike. Let's do this.
I'm interested because I resonate with it, and I'm assuming,
Yeah.
certainly knowing on some level my audience, there is a lot of resonance in that
Yeah.
resistance to exploring who we are.
So good. Well, for one thing, I think that the idea of who we are in general is a fascinating concept. So much of my own psychological background was around personality theory and personality development, as well as maladaptive personality development. And when I look at most of current culture, I see a giant swath of what I would call maladaptive personality development. In other words, the thing that we think we are, we actually really aren't. Most of us walk around thinking that our judging, assessing mind is us. This mind that is simply belching out stories and preferences and opinions and likes and dislikes. And we think that that's us, rather than our conditioning, our coding, our consequences of our choices, other people's choices, on and on. And when we come to realize that actually the thing that we've gone around thinking was us is just our assessing, judging mind, that in fact has been incredibly programmed and barely bears any resemblance to who we are at a very deep level, we stop really knowing how to talk about ourselves, right? The most eloquent, but honestly, just the most functional answer is, I am the one who is observing the mask. I am the one who is observing the judgments. I am the one who is witnessing the preferences and witnessing this storytelling machine-like mind that's simply out there. And really, that's just it. Once you begin to see that, you become incredibly bored with the descriptions. Like, well, I can tell you what I do, I can tell you how I show up, I can tell you about all of those things, but really there's something far more intrinsic, like what Rumi says, the face that was yours before you were born. Like, that's what I want to know about. That's and so the resistance is that, right? Because life is always changing, life is ever shifting and moving, and if we're honest, if we're really honest, we're always changing with it. We really are. And so that crystalline thing that we say, I am, that's not really us. That's something that got frozen in place at some point in time and is a rigid construct that keeps us safe and secure and keeps others safe and secure, because then they know where to interact with us and what products to sell us. And so that's all very nice. But the real me is something so more fluid, something so more dynamic. I love that.
Yeah, beautiful. And you know, one of the things I'd heard in there, first of all, was like a resonance from a younger version of me, which of course is still me, and that was this like resistance to change, which of course, you know, by what you've just stated, you know, is fighting against life in a sense.
That's right.
Because you know, life has changed. So then what would you say to someone listening who hears that, you know, okay, shit, so you know, I have this idea of who I am, and okay, maybe what that is my observation of the world and judgments, and you know, I've picked up on some identity things. I need to be fluid. How do I connect to what that is?
Yeah. Ooh, that's so good. Well, first of all, just stay tuned to life. It'll have a way of beating the shit out of you. You'll eventually come to I hope it's okay if I swore there. I apologize if not, but of course I'll edit that out later. There's this sense, I think, that that life has a way of bringing everything to the surface eventually. You know, sometimes I think of life sort of like we're born almost as this clear and rather pristine body of water that at some point in time, you know, like an alpine lake, the cold winds blow, the disappointments come, and that lake freezes over. Right. And that top layer is ice. And that top layer is a protective layer, keeping all the life beneath safe. But it's also a preventative layer. Prevents all that life from crawling out and getting up and getting around and all of those good things. The fish can't really jump anymore unless a nice fisherman comes and cuts a hole in the ice, and then they can jump out. And so I think that that's really how our personality works. If we think of ourselves very clearly, it's sort of like we're that limitless potential, but the cold winds blow. A crystalline layer forges over us so that we're defended against the disappointments of the world. We develop these elaborate coping techniques and defense strategies that we think we are, but really are just that topmost layer, so to speak. So why this is relevant is because at some point in life, the cracks begin to form, just like they have for me, just like maybe they have for you or for many others listening, that disappointments set in. You lose the job, right? You lose the relationship. You lose the reputation. Your partner says, I cheated, or even worse, they don't say that yet. They say, we need to talk. Or something happens, a child dies, or your hero suddenly is depedestalized, and you're left with the crack in the ice right there. And that's when we go to therapy. That's when we go to coaches. That's when we go to the religious institutions, and we say desperately, rather desperately, please patch the ice back up. Please put life back together. This feels horrible, feels out of control. But that's really when people come to me, and maybe they come trying to get the ice put back. Let me get the job back. Let me get the girl back. Let me get the reputation back. And my job in that is as a faithful friend and spiritual mentor in some way, is to actually not, in fact, patch the ice back up at all. It's to widen the gap. It's to actually keep the ice dissolving so that what we're left with is flow again.
Mm.
So you ask, how does a man show up and do this? Well, first of all, just pay attention to your life. There's cracks in the ice right now,
Mm.
right? How are you not listening? Is one of the things, right? Oftentimes the forms of feedback come over and over and over. And particularly as men, we're so wired to be resistant to feedback,
Mm.
right? Like we can have been fired from 10 jobs in a row and it was all their fault. And the next one will be the good one who will finally understand me and get me,
Yeah.
right? It's like, I have nothing to do with it. And why did every boss say that, I was an asshole? I don't know. It's on them. Well, it's like, well, maybe there's a form of feedback, or why are you always attracting unavailable partners, or why are you always cheating on your partners, or all these different things, right? These are the questions I ask myself. It's like, God, like until you finally sit down and yourself and say, what's happening?
Mm.
I had an abscess tooth. Now, I didn't know it was abscess. And I don't know if that means the same thing in New Zealand, but here's what it means. It means that I was writhing on the ground. Like after a year of ignoring it. I'm not even
Oh,
joking. I had ignored this tooth.
recently or a long time ago?
Well, I'd like to say it was a long time ago, but
Thought that might be a nice piece of context.
right. It was actually a while ago. But the funny thing about this tooth was that I had been able sufficiently to ignore the pain, to put Tylenol in my body, to distract for about a year. And I'm writhing on the floor with like a towel in my jaw, like clenching down on it, trying to get through it, moaning, like like this horrible sound coming out of my mouth. And my partner looked at me and she said, "You've got to go to the dentist. You've got to go." And I think what that funny little humorous story tells me, because by the time I got to the dentist looks at it and says, "This is abscess. Like you're putting poison into your brain at this point. You could have died." Right. So they extract the tooth like immediately in a surgery. Now, this is like life, right?
Mm.
We get these forms of feedback usually as pain, just overwhelming pain.
Mm.
Right? Like the relationship hurts, all the relationships hurt, the job is miserable, all these things, right? A lot of pain. And then finally, somebody we really care about comes along and says, "Hey, I can't tolerate this anymore. You've been able to live with it just fine, but I can't live with it anymore." And that's when a lot of people start to go, oh, I've got to do something about this.
Mm. And also what I'm hearing in there is like all the examples that I've heard, because pain can be that obvious. Hey, it's a fucking abscess in your tooth, and the job, but it can also be so many things. And one of the things that I see and resonate with myself as well is sometimes they are subtle, because I'm assuming a year earlier than writhing on the ground, biting on the towel, it was very subtle. And we become very good at ignoring those subtle pieces of feedback, which is what you're speaking to, right? And so one of the things that I'm really picking up from all of what you've been sharing there is you said, like, watch your life, like pay attention, be present, because we are getting signals often. But when we become skilled at switching off to them, at taking the Tylenol, or maybe it's some other form of hiding or distracting or numbing from it, we are choosing to go into a form of self-delusion almost.
Yeah. Whew. And that's it, isn't it? We're choosing rather relentlessly a form of avoiding reality as it is. Yeah.
So, okay. that might be something that takes some wrestling with, receiving, perhaps. So what I want to explore next, which I think potentially is a related tangent, and that is, I've seen you talk about, because one of the things we're talking about here is like connect to the messages and the feedback that's there, and we might connect to what is truer for us in this moment, right? And that's the thing I also picked up there with the fluidity, and there's like reconnecting back to your essential self. And there's this term that I think we hear, I certainly see it in the pop culture, personal development world, let's say, and it's living your truth. And so it's the kind of term that, like, I believe I understand on a level, but I believe that, when it speaks to my audience, it's one of those terms that's kind of like, what is that? What is that even? How do I,
Yeah.
first of all, what is my truth? Because it's a very easy thing to also jump on and say, you live your truth, with like a heavy hint of sarcasm. So when it comes to paying attention, noticing the tells and the feedback and what life is presenting to us, so we can get to that more essential, truer self. What does a term like that really mean for, let's call it, the everyday man?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I used to work with adults who experienced disabilities, and I showed up to work with a new gentleman who had been working with a previous caseworker for some time, and I was new to him. And he was in his 40s. He had developmental delays, and I think presented as having Down's syndrome. And he was very articulate, and he had this jersey on with a long retired basketball player on the back of it, and from the area I live in. And I said, "Oh, wow, yeah, he used to be my favorite player." And Sean was his name. Sean took great offense to the word used to be. And he said, like, what do you mean used to be? He's still my favorite player. And I said, oh, well, yeah, he'll always be my favorite, but he's retired now. And he said, no, he is not retired. And, at that point, I'm engaged enough with the facts that I need him to know this is in fact not the case. And so I say, well, no, Sean, he is in fact retired. And he looked at me and he said, no, my truth. And I thought that was just hilarious. The hyper subjectivity. Like, he understood, of course, something I think it takes most of us a great deal of time to understand, that there is a difference between objective and subjective truth, right here. He was squarely committed to living in subjective reality. I think a lot of times when people say those kind of terms, like, no, I'm living my truth, I always get a bit of a chuckle myself. I think of Sean. I think in some ways it boils down to that. In my mind, there's really just truth.
Yeah.
And I think we get very delusional when we start trying to dissect and navigate and dodge. And when anyone says, like, in my opinion, especially in the workshops I lead for men, I always stop them and I say, listen, let's be fair. There's only your opinion if you're saying it. I'm not confused that somehow or another you have this high-minded plateau where you can see all truth reasonably. I am aware that it is in your opinion, otherwise you wouldn't be saying it. So we can drop the pretense here.
Yeah.
When people say things like my truth or in my opinion, I almost inevitably want them to drop the subjectivity, because I already understand it's subjective, right? Our access to objective truth, even if it existed, and that's a philosophic question, but even if objective truth existed, even if there's a ground beneath my feet, my ability to see it is so limited, of course, that the only thing I really have is my perspective. As Nietzsche said, every point of view is a view from a point. And so, of course, this is just where I'm standing. It's just my location. And so I don't have to be ashamed of it. I don't have to be scared of it. I don't have to wonder about it. I just say, this is the facts. This is the facts. Now, of course, the other side of that is like a degree of humility. This is the facts. These are the facts as I see them. Right. That's what's the truth right there. Of course, I don't have a full range. And someone who has a degree of humility knows that their opinion about the facts can in fact be changed by someone else having competing facts. Right. And so we would say, well, how do my facts line up with your facts? But when we say living my truth, like, what do we really mean? Because we're not talking about facts anymore. Right. The facts are what happened. The truth is why it happened. It's the meaning I attach to it. It's the stories I build out of those facts. But if I look at just the facts, and that's really where I invite people to come back to, right? To their senses. What do you smell? What do you taste? What do you touch? What do you hold? Tell me those things. Let's get back to our senses. Let's observe those, because there's really three levels of reality or truthiness that we can kind of observe. Like the first level of reality is really what's happening in my body. Now, like, I know what's happening in my body. And right now I say, well, I kind of have a pain in my right toe. And you don't know that by looking at me, but I know that. And I would say, well, and I feel fuzzy in my body today. I didn't feel yesterday. I feel fuzzy today. I know what's happening. The second layer of reality is the things happening outside of me. Well, right now my skin feels cold. I'm observing that there's some cold, and I'm observing this beautiful human being, Mike Campbell, who's elsewhere in the world, and I have this microphone shoved into my face, and so there's this outside reality, right? Well, then there's a third layer, which is my thoughts and my emotions based upon the things that I've seen. So these are now all facts. And so I would say, well, I have this one story that tells me I shut off the heater yesterday and that it got colder outside. Unbeknownst to me, I hadn't looked at the weather, and I should have looked at the weather, and I should have turned on the heater, and that would have been more appropriate. And hopefully my kids aren't going to be mad at me, and I'll have to go fix that after I'm done talking to them, and maybe I won't have to wear this blanket around. You see how ridiculous, of course, all that is, but that's the layers of truth. That's reality as it is. So when we talk about my truth or living what my truth is, I'm not really interested in my truth. I'm interested in reality as it is. Most of us get so hung up in the meaning making of life, right? And what we don't know, I recently talked about this where I said people are addicted to meaning making and it's making them miserable. And someone came on and said, oh, that's my great superpower. That's my magic. Don't take away my magic. I make meaning out of the world. I tell stories. This is my magic. Right. And I said, well, of course, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I don't want to take away your superpower. In fact, it's making you very, very happy. I can tell. It's also going to make you very, very miserable. And if you can live with the misery, that's fine. But most of us hit a point where we actually get tired of being sick and tired. Right. And so that's when we say, I'm going to let all of that extemporaneous storytelling about life go so that I can just come back to what is. I can come back to what is, what I can see and taste and touch and hold and handle, and my thoughts and my stories that I've told myself about them too, that I can observe. So when I say my truth, that's really what I mean.
Yes. And so then when I take that on board and I hear it and then I go, okay, cool. So then what does that look like for me being authentic and getting to my essential self?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's when desires come in. So that's what I think of when I think of like that essence. I take reality as it is, my thoughts and my desires, my wants. So, boy, I don't have my object lessons in hand, but on the final night of the men's group that I lead called Rope, which is all about deconstructing those layers of reality and who I think I am, I hold up a red pen and a black pen, and I invite someone to choose. Oh, you've got them. Perfect. So red or black, Mike, red or black? Black.
Chosen the black.
Why?
Chosen the black.
Why?
Great question.
Yeah. Well, my guess is there's not a great answer, right?
No. What comes to me then is black. Like I'm wearing black, and so I've seen this, and I think I just connected to the black.
Yeah, right. Like you just connected to the black, and that's just it. Like it wasn't very complicated, and we complicate things with reasons and justifications and assessments and blame and excuses, all kinds of things, just to get around to saying I want black. I want black, right? I want chocolate ice cream. I want whatever it is. Like tonight, my partner said, what kind of tacos do you want? Do you want chicken tacos or do you want beef? I didn't think a lot about it. I just said chicken, right? And I think most of us go through life trying to attach these profound dilemmas or quandaries to what is actually relatively simple. Now, I'm not saying get simple. I'm saying it is already simple.
Yeah.
It is already simple. And you will attach or build or construct numerous stories to justify the thing you want to do in the first place. Our reasoning mind usually is dragged around by our emotions anyway. And so when I talk about like true self, what I'm talking about is getting free of the constructed nature of my persona. So this is no longer being attached to or dependent upon what the government's telling me to think, or what society's telling me to think, or religion's telling me to think, or the corporations, right? It's getting beyond thinking that I'm the only one who wants to go to Bali, right? As it turns out, a lot of people do. Why? Well, I mean, it could be because it's on our Instagrams every day, maybe, right? I'm not the only one who wants that really cool SUV that just came out. Well, my kids are kind of blown away by this. You know, my daughter, this is a silly story. I got to stop sharing this. At some point, she's going to hate me for it. But we didn't have it. Well, so she was 5 when this went down. She's 9 now. And we were in between houses. Our house was being finished, and we were staying with my parents. My parents had television, we didn't. And so this was the first time that my kids had been exposed to TV commercials. Right. And one day, my 5-year-old daughter comes in and announces to her mother and I need a bamboo pillow. And she was very matter of fact about it too. And you know, we're like, oh, well, why do you need a bamboo pillow? And she says, to help me sleep better. Well, now we're concerned. We're like, oh, we didn't know that you weren't sleeping. Are you not sleeping well? Are you okay? And she's like, oh, I'm fine. But the TV said that I would sleep better if I had a bamboo pillow. Now, she said that straight out, just like that. She believed it 100%. It wasn't that she was sleeping badly. It just better was a mythic land that the television had sold her on. Yeah. And it's like, we're constantly being inundated with these ridiculous messages that we're believing about this mythic land called better. So once I step away from those and extract from trying to look good or trying to sound right or fit in or be justified or win or avoid being controlled, once I step away from those layers, it boils down to something really simple, like red or black, or chocolate or vanilla, or what do you want? And once you can learn to simply, honestly, very matter-of-factly say what I want. This is what I want. Life gets really fun. It might not mean you get what you want, but it does mean that you'll have another conversation. And then you just keep on showing up to those conversations, to what you want, and to going from there. And it's very, very straightforward.
So thank you for that. And I love the story, man. Yeah, but I can sleep better. I mean, I can just imagine, you know, like the cogs in her little brain being like, it's obvious, hello, because I just learned it from a thing. And, you know, we learn things and we apply them. So this guy surely had wonderful intentions on the television thing there. Okay, so then, you know, we have all the messaging. And there's a couple of things I want to explore. One is, you know, as you said, like we're subject to all these messages and wherever they come from. It might be the television. You know, and I think, you know, the copywriting resources that have gone into advertisements and infomercials must be some of the greatest in the world, right? But then, of course, we're subject to so many different messages. So is there something that you would say to the man listening who thinks, no, you know, like I grew up and I became me. I have, you know, total free will in who I am and how I be. Whereas perhaps there is a bunch of things that he might be missing there. And so there might be room for connecting into seeing how he is perhaps performing who he thinks he needs to be.
Well, a very simple experiment. And maybe you can help me do this one right now. Maybe the listeners at home or on their drive can do it with us. I'm going to just invite you in a couple of moments to stop thinking. Okay, so let's just count to 2, 1, 2, and stop. So now you can restart thinking. And I'm just going to ask you on behalf of you and then everyone else, how did that experiment go for you? How long did you get totally stopping all thought?
I would think not at all.
Well, I would think you would be right.
I closed my eyes, and then in my mind's eye, I thought about what I was witnessing in my mind's eye. Is the only way I can explain that.
That's so great. That's a great description. And I think you probably made it further than most people. And certainly I did the first time I ever considered something like that. We like to think that we're in control of our thoughts, right? The reality is our thoughts are thinking us. We are anything but in control of our thoughts. If we were in control of our thoughts, we could stop them. We can't. They're just kind of like a factory in there, just like belching out thought, doing their thing, right? And I think that for a lot of guys who might be hearing this, they go, well, that's fine. I'm fine with that. Okay, well, how is being dragged around by your thoughts going for you? Really? Right. My guess is, from having met enough people and scratched just below the surface, that it's actually not working for them. Right. It leads them into all kinds of calamitous situations, all kinds of precarious moments with friends, with coworkers, with spouses, right, where they're desperately out of control. Right. And so I think by actually getting to a much simpler way of living, where we're no longer living out of our assessing, judging mind, but we're stepping into that place of will, or like what I want, just as it is. We find that there's a degree of control there by simply showing up to the event horizon, which is my word for the present, the event horizon, just honestly. Right? It's like there's a shimmering wall in front of me, and that's the present moment. And I can live up there to the degree to which I can observe it and describe it accurately with just the facts, total authenticity to the moment.
Without all my story in there.
Right.
And my
exactly. When I have all that story and that meaning making you just referenced, it's like having 300 or 300 feet of buffers in between me and the present moment. Right. And that's when I start to get real unhappy with life. That's when I start to feel listless and hopeless and dragged around by events. You know, I will share one more rather silly story about my daughter. Same age period. We moved into that new home, and it has a very large front kind of picture window overlooking the street. And we moved in September, and then in January it snowed very heavily. And the street was covered in maybe 2 feet of snow, buried in snow. And she was standing there in her nightgown, looking very precociously out at the street. And we were all warm in our house, and there was a fire. She was there standing looking at the snowy street, when suddenly I turn my back and feel a cold draft of wind. And I look over, and she has run out the front door. And I look now from that window, and I see her running in the snow in her nightgown, barefoot, down the street. So I run after her and finally chase her down. She got pretty damn far, and I catch up with her, and I kind of pick her up in my arms. She's shivering, she's cold, and I say, "Hun, what were you doing?" And she said, "I was chasing the neighbor's dog." She was chasing the neighbor's dog. It seemed like a good idea at the time. In reality, this is most of us. Most of us are standing there looking at reality, and instead of letting reality pass in front of us, we're out the front door chasing every thought down the road. It's like we have a thought and suddenly we're running after it, or we have an emotion and suddenly we're following it, which is all fine and well, except the street's hell. Right? It's like, it's dangerous out there. Much better if we observe it. Much better if we stand at that window and watch it. I've had a million thoughts. They come and go. I've had a million feelings. They come and go. I'm still here. I'm the one who observes my thoughts. I'm the one who observes my feelings. And so that's really how we can show up to reality in very accurate ways and begin to live fulfilled lives, because we're not being dragged around anymore. We're living right up close to that event horizon.
I love it. And I'm also getting the visual of like, probably because of the size of the dog and the amount of snow, the dog was actually not visible to anyone else apart from your daughter, which probably speaks exactly to our thoughts. So something there I want to touch on is and it's potentially taking me into something else I want to speak about, but you know, through the work that I do, and I'm sure you do as well, you know, in a very broad statement, emotions can be a challenging thing for a lot of men to even understand. So, you know, here you speak there about, you know, observing it, right, but not being dragged around to it. So how does that differ from essentially ignoring and not, you know, actually feeling and processing my emotions?
This is such a great question, Mike. I really appreciate it because, you know, there's something that passes for the ancient philosophy of Stoicism going around among the men's movements today that has very little to do.
Is what I call it.
Exactly. That is exactly it. And it sounds a lot like unplugging or disconnecting from emotions. So let's talk about emotions. Emotions are really just a part of the data loop of our nervous system. You can kind of think about them as. And while we don't want to get too detailed about it, there's a difference between feelings and emotions, right? And feelings are physiological. Feelings are really what happens in our body. Yeah. Emotions, on the other hand, are things that happen when we add our interpretations and our stories and our thoughts to those events that are occurring in our world that remind us of other older events or other things that we've had. And so, you know, you can kind of think as an emotion as a very complicated thing that has a lot more to do with your interpretations of something than it does with the thing in itself. Right. So whenever you're exactly. So whatever you're experiencing, your emotion, it may be justified, meaning it's congruent with the event, or not, depending on the story you've told. A great example of this is when my mom died. Now, she didn't really die. The truth is, I just couldn't get a hold of her after 3 phone calls. The phone rang 3 different times. And for whatever reason, that day, maybe I'd had a bad day or something, I instantly began to believe that my mother had fallen down, had broken her hip, choked on her own vomit, died, you know, uncontrollably. And I instantly began to feel something like profound sadness and grief. The emotion I experienced was grief, total agony, really sad, which makes total sense if, in fact, my mother died, which was the story I was telling. However, when I called her the 4th time and got a hold of her frantically, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just on the other line with your father. How are you?" And then all of a sudden, well, the emotion evaporates, right? It didn't quite dissipate in my body. I still kind of felt that tightness. But the truth was, when I checked the facts, that emotion wasn't justified. Totally valid. Oh, every emotion is valid, but not every emotion fits the facts. So what is the emotion? Well, it's just data. It's just data about all those different things. Here's the thing. If you're ignoring your emotions, you're missing the data. If you're ignoring the emotions, you're missing the data. So that if I walk into that dark, frightening alley and ignore the fear I'm experiencing, I might as well deserve to get hit on the back of my head, right? And mugged and robbed there. Totally justified because I ignored the data. I shouldn't have ignored it. I should have listened to it and checked it out. Does it fit the facts? Well, yes, actually, there's been those 10 newspaper clippings that have just happened within the last week about lots of people getting mugged there. The difference between, shall we say, true stoicism and this pseudo stoicism that passes in the men's movement, or the difference between ignoring and stuffing your emotions and actually truly discerning and not following them around, is that in one, we totally acknowledge them. So I tell people, acknowledge it. So if someone, say, comes to me with a story about their dad, I go, "Oh, and how did you feel?" And they might say, "Oh, I felt a little mad." I say, "Oh, no, you didn't. You felt," and they go, "Oh yeah, you felt angry. What else?" I want to get it all out, like to the juiciest extreme. And then maybe I migrate back and I go, "Now, You felt really outraged at your dad. Now that's interesting. I wonder what the story was there. And then we get out the story and we start to excavate it. And then we go, now, do you think that was a justified emotion or not? And they say, "Hmm, no, it probably wasn't." And I go, oh, I actually think it was, because you know what? He really wronged you, and your goal was actually, and then all of a sudden they go, what? My emotion made sense? Yeah. And what did it make you want to do? Well, I wanted to yell at him. Is that all? Well, no, I actually wanted to punch him in the face. And I go, oh, that's great. Oh, that's real good. Now, let me ask you, would that have been a very effective decision? And they would go, well, no, that wouldn't have gotten me very far. Great, great. So you see, with all those things, what am I doing? I'm helping them get everything out on the table so that they can make choices. It's very hard to go into a furniture store, like a big warehouse. That's in the United States. Like all the furniture stores are these giant barns of furniture,
Yes.
and it's like if someone told you to go into that furniture barn and pick out a nice couch, it'd be very hard to do so if the lights were off. Right. And so really adequately knowing your emotions, knowing what you're experiencing and what's happening is like fully turning on the lights, or like standing at the picture window and watching it. You really have to see it for what it is. You observe it, you describe it, and then you learn how to participate with it. Stuffing your emotions is a really ignorant way of going through life. And I mean that just quite literally, because you can't see. You're ignoring it, and then you don't have options.
Yeah,
You're just getting dragged around.
Where I'm going with this in my head as well is like your daughter in that instance, instead of like running out the door and following it, she runs back up to her room and buries her head under a pillow and says, nah, there's no snow.
Right, exactly. Right, which is actually what a lot of children do. You think about kids who get
Scary
hurt.
thing. Yeah.
Right, a scary thing. It doesn't exist. I can't look at it. I can't look at it. Well, if I get a wound and I don't look at it, right, like it reasonably might go gangrenous. I might lose that big toe, right, whatever that is. And so you have to look at the thing, or the tooth in this case. I did lose the tooth.
Yes. I love it. Beautiful. And I'm getting in that, the clarity of, as you said, the data, right? And there's an analogy I really like, that I think speaks to switching on the light as well. And it's, if you were faced with doing a jigsaw puzzle, but you didn't know what the picture was and you didn't have half of the pieces, yet you were just blindly, potentially in the dark as well, just grabbing a piece and hoping to see where it lands, or ignoring, that you need to get it. Once we can turn the light on and get all the pieces, now I have the data, I know what I'm dealing with. It becomes easier to start, moving forward, as it were, or at least making sense of the picture in front of me.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. Right. Once you know what the pieces are, you can start to make sense of things. So we have to look at what is. Yeah. And that actually means that kind of honesty we were talking about a few moments ago. You really have to have an unflinching, a real fierce commitment to looking at the thing as it is, to not dressing it up. Right. And that starts with self. Right. I have to have an unrelenting commitment to looking at the thing as it is. And so the levels that you take off, like without trying to look good, without explaining, without justifying, without reasoning, so much of what we call reasons are just excuses. And so if I cut all those things away and I get down to just the core of it, and usually that's something very physical. This happened. Then this happened, then this happened. It's very behavioral, right? It's just a behavior. Yeah. Once I get down to that, that's the facts. And then, boy, then there's reality, and I can start to decide.
Yeah, beautiful. So now where I want to take this is, obviously you work with me and you've referenced it a couple of times. We're speaking there about emotions. And so there's something that I saw you share on social media, speaking of that earlier, and it was around uninitiated masculine, and there was a series of points that you put there. I don't expect you to remember them all, but there was one that you said at the very top, which speaks to something that we've been talking about right now, and it was the uninitiated masculine explodes emotion rather than explores it. And to me, that's what we're talking about right here, exploring emotion. So I'd love if you could take us into, you know, this idea of uninitiated masculine and perhaps what else that looks like. And even if you will, what seem to be the consequences?
Well, I think we're living in the consequences for what it's worth. But let's talk about that. Meaning, I think we live in a culture that is characterized by a failure of nerve at every level, an inability to have anything like steadfastness. We're untethered, spinning out of orbit, right? Over and over. I think we all feel it. We all feel it. You know, it's like it had been a bad year last year, and most of us had forgotten there were forest fires in Australia, right? Like we're just moving on to the next bad problem, problem to problem. We forget the one right before it. You know, we're spinning to the next solution, the next solve, the next whatever it is. We're a culture and a society that lives with amnesia. There's no constancy. And I think that there's a profound hostility between men and women, between men and men, between children and parents. I think the divisions that exist between us are growing larger and larger and larger, so that we barely recognize one another. We barely recognize ourselves when we look in the mirror. I think I don't have to use clinical words like depression or anxiety to talk about the dis-ease that most of us simply feel, wake up with. I think most everyone I know exists with now low-level depression, low-level anxiety, right? You might have a good day if you go through your day and you see two smiling faces, right? Because it's just like, where is anyone happy anymore? Really happy? I had an experience where I was at the coast with my partner, and there was a gentleman in front of us who was smiling, real big smile, real big smile. And he was in the line in front of us. He ordered his coffee and thanked the lady profusely. And he walked off to wait for his drink. And she looked up at us with big, large eyes. And she said, "What kind of drugs was he on?" Right? Because to smile anymore is like to be on drugs, right? It's like, what's wrong with him? And I think that's a real easy way of understanding it. I think another way of understanding it is that most of us are living in kind of this ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss, where we're with someone, but they're not really there. They're on their phone. We're sitting across from them at a restaurant. We're both disengaged from one another. Or you might see someone, you know, sitting in a public place, and it's like they're looking off. It's like they're space cadets. And most of us, it's like divorce rates are up. I think dropouts, suicides, at every level. The collective dis-ease is so overwhelming that I think if you're not seeing it, you're not looking. And so I would say that all of those things, I began to march backwards towards a certain kind of uninitiation. So if I would just talk about that, first of all, that post that I made was incredibly unfair. Here's what I mean. There isn't just one initiation. There are a series of developmental initiations that I would call thresholds of initiations. Primarily, the one that I was talking about is really the first one in transition between an adolescent to towards an early 20-something male. That's really like the first cultural initiation, what most anthropologists understood as initiation. That's the one I was talking about. But to be honest and to be fair, there are several more initiations that I think bring several more layers of wisdom, and I kind of mashed all of them up for that post. So it was a tremendously unfair post. It was almost like an impossible task. So I'll admit that. But let's talk about.
I will also, you know, come in there quickly on a perspective, which is, I hear that, but I also feel like a post like that or a point like that can at least serve a purpose of, as you said, you know, waking someone up to explore.
Yeah.
Now, if they take that as gospel and run with it, that's different.
Right. That's true. You know, everything that's right doesn't need to be said right now. And so I was certainly going to come back and elucidate that. And maybe this is my shot. most of what we think of as toxic masculinity, which I think gets thrown around a lot, is really just immature masculinity, uninitiated masculinity. So let's talk about what the role of initiation was. Initiation in traditional cultures, in hunter-gatherer, immediate return band societies, as anthropologists would call them, which was every society that existed before 8,000 years ago. And, up till even 150 years ago, was at least still 30% of the human population on this planet. So today it's less than 5%. But when we think of hunter-gatherer societies, these traditional cultures that were all of us up till a certain point in time, almost all of them, and in fact, everyone that I can think of, involved male initiation. So why males and why initiation, this external process? Well, for one thing, females underwent an internal initiatory process where they experienced something like death, a confrontation with their own mortality, their own finitude. Very early on, when she passes into menses, when she begins to have her first ovulation, and then that cycle begins, right? And this was a powerful source of self-modality that began to occur for a young woman that had almost no external counterpart for a male. Men do not, boys do not intrinsically experience death. So let's think about what happens when you don't, in fact, confront the idea of mortality. Well, what happens? You run from it your whole life. In fact, most of who I work with are people who are running from mortality in one way or the other. They're scared to die. They're scared to live. They're scared to have big experiences. They're scared to risk it all. Right? Why? Well, death. The one faithful friend that we can all count on is the one thing most of us try and avoid a lot of our life. Primitive cultures understood that was absolutely unacceptable. You were a hair's breadth away from death at any point in time. You could not afford, the tribe could not afford for you to flinch at death. So they knew that boys had to undergo the same thing that girls had to undergo, which was a confrontation with mortality. Furthermore, a boy was no good to the tribe if he couldn't confront the hard things in life. And particularly because of the wonderful post-birth attachment system that looked like an external regulating of emotions, meaning that the child was within 11 seconds of his primary caregiver. Anytime he cried, within 11 seconds, a primary caregiver would respond within his first 4 years of being alive. Because this was possible, there also was a real comfort, a holding space, what the primary attachment researchers understood as what they called environments of evolutionary adaptivity, or holding spaces. The boy felt cradled and coddled and loved, and it was so wonderful. But if he lived there, he became addicted to it, soft. He would never meet the hardships,
I suspect,
and useless to the tribe, which, humans' great advantage was the tribe. We were like a little lower than hyenas in the tall grass and in the savannas. And so we actually had to develop something really wonderful like belonging. From that place of learning how to belong and learning to connect to one another, we banded together to form these societies called tribes, and we needed one another. We had to have one another. And so in that experience and in that expanse of needing one another, we needed to know that we could count on one another. And for boys, we needed to know that they wouldn't run back to mom all the time. They actually wouldn't flinch in the face of hardship, that life was hard and they were adequate to it, and they weren't scared of dying. A boy who didn't know how to do that was useless to the tribe. He couldn't hunt, he couldn't defend, he couldn't protect the things that were necessary for him to do, that we needed him to do. He couldn't. And so they needed to test him. And it required a bit of a re-brainwashing, because he had to, in fact, be taken care of during his early life. And there was no internal process that would make him wake up to that. So it had to be external. So the first initiation happened between the ages of 9 to 13 years old, depending on the tribe. And he was forcibly extracted from the arms of his primary caregiver, usually his mother. The men of the tribe came in by night, drums beating, rip him away very forcibly, and take him. And there he confronts death. Now, different cultures enacted this in a variety of ways, and quite frankly, most of them are appalling and would give all of us shivers, and I won't recount them. But the important part, the important context is they faced the ultimate end, and they walked away knowing they could face it. It was a way of saying what that rock band from the 90s, the Eels, who sang a song called Novocaine for the Soul, it was what they said. Life is hard, and so am I. And a boy who came back from his initiation came back saying that. I am adequate to life. The tribe then knew for discipline, for protection, for assertiveness, for activeness, for courage, and ultimately on behalf of the tribe. So that really is it.
In that process, then is there, kind of quote unquote, a death of the little boy, or at least a part of him who was, as you said, not necessarily attached, but maybe the 11 seconds from mother, etc.
Yeah. And in fact, he really loses something. That little boy loses connection to something very soft, something very, very wonderful, the feminine. And he finds that in the world. Actually, the world, Earth, Gaia itself becomes his new mother. The tribe becomes his new caretaker. If he's not extracted from that individualized feminine, his mother, his physical mother, he'll never be able to be reprogrammed to be a member of Earth's society. And it was very important for him to connect to the earth as mother. So that was another part of it. He had to really die to her and die to that tender part of himself. Now, here's what's interesting. And this is when we start talking about further initiations. That lasts during what our mutual friend Dallas Hartwig and I have called the hunter stage. We've termed it the hunter stage as a stage in which the primary job was to adequately provide for and protect and preserve the tribe as a hunter. Now, we chose that instead of warrior because, quite frankly, warrior skills weren't needed except in the last 16,000 years. Humans have been humans for the last 350,000 years, long before we needed warrior skills. And so that 350,000 year period, males were typically relied upon to be the hunter. And that involved a very specific skill set, including, I might add, ritualistic warrior skills. So that was very important. But at a certain point, roughly at the end of his 20s, something happens. His physical mastery begins to fail him. He can't run as fast as the younger boys. He's not relied on to hunt as much anymore. There are problems his body can no longer solve, which is new. Because before that, he could solve anything with his body. There wasn't a problem he couldn't just solve with it. He couldn't think his way out of it as a hunter. He had to learn new skills. And in order to do so, he has to go inward. As the testosterone is waning, his own emotionality begins to increase. And suddenly he begins to experience something that feels more like the feminine he cut away. And this is the stage we call the philosopher stage. It's really a new threshold where he has to go inward and alchemize that lost part of himself that was lost when he was extracted from mother, and it begins to come online again. And there he begins to feel his inner feminine. That stage, which traditionally would have happened to a man in his, say, second phase of life, what we would call our 30s, you alchemize the masculine and the feminine, the soft and the hard, the angular and the subtle begin to balance during that stage. That's when a man goes inward. And a lot of men experience that today, but don't know what's happening. They don't know it's a very natural process.
Yeah, it can feel like an immense discomfort or confusion or cloudiness, feeling lost. And I suppose it makes perfect sense when there isn't the guidance through, which of course all of these things had crucial guidance.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then what to, the guys that are like potentially resonating with, my modern version of hunter, which is this, in some level, like getting out and attacking life and building and protecting and providing, etc. Oh, okay. So at some point later, I reconnect back into the softer side. Am I in that post first initiation, stepping into early manhood and the hunter phase, disconnected from, like, essentially
Mm-hmm.
connection into myself and other humans
Mm-hmm.
in my tribe?
Well, one of the fail safes of the hunter stage was the tribe itself, belonging, right? You could not be a sociopath and be an effective hunter. You actually had to attune to the emotions of everyone else in the tribe. So to say you were emotionless, that wouldn't work, right? It really, really wouldn't. And so, a lot of guys in that first stage might think they're disconnecting from emotions, they're cutting away from their need to have those things. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But it comes on far larger. They feel it to a far greater degree later and secondarily. I would insert here that for so many in our society, because we have not had that, even that first initiation I talked about, for so many men post 1960s today, they have not, in fact, had anything like that first initiation. And one might argue for many in Western culture, it has been as long as Western culture has existed, we have not had that. But if you could imagine that most of us kind of skipped ahead and instead became the soft inner kind of philosopher man boy, right? Which was like that tender, the tender parts were there. Now, if that's true, if you're a man in your 30s and you're, feeling a little more of that alchemical, like I blend the masculine and blend the feminine, I'm going to actually suggest to you don't, in fact, blend them at all. That, in fact, you never really encountered that masculine initiation, that initiation into your hardness. You probably just skipped the whole thing and became what we would call a philosopher. But a philosopher who becomes a philosopher without actually having sufficiently embodied the hunter is a vampire. Here's what I mean. Think about vampires. Vampires are civilized. They're soft. They're delicate. Oh, the women love the vampires. Just watch Anne Rice's interview with a vampire. I mean, like Vampire looks hot. My God. Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, the finest. And so I think of these very soft, wonderful vampires who are very domesticated. Oh, they can read emotions. Their gal pals love to rely on them. They rely on their gal pals. They lean their heads on their shoulders, and then when they're not looking, they suck their blood. And this is how so many men present in life. Right? So many men present in life where when life is hard, they turn to their gal pal, they call their best friend, they call their mom, they call their sister, they call, all the feminine. They've got 35 feminine friends, female friends, male or female, feminine friends, people who embody the essence of the feminine. And they call them when the chips, because they don't have the internal resources to match the hardness of life. So they externalize that need to all of these people who will not just provide answers, but just comfort. And then they drain those resources. They drain them discreetly.
And so what happens when the vampire comes up against the initiated hunter who has, matched the hardness of life?
Yeah, well, for one thing, the initiated hunter wants almost nothing to do with the vampire. He really doesn't. And I think a lot of men experience this. If we could unmetaphorize this, a lot of men experience kind of like awakening up, like, oh man, I realized that I've kind of just wallowed around and got big. I never actually matured. I'm soft inside. So you call your friends who actually might be hunters. You call your friends who might be that more warrior mindset or builders. They're stronger, they're harder, and they're like, oh yeah, cool. Thanks for calling. Right? They actually don't really want to hang out with you. And you're like, foiled again. Why won't they take me hunting with them? Right? It's because they don't really want to have anything to do with you. Right? There's this great scene in the movie The 13th Warrior, which I don't necessarily recommend on the whole, but I enjoyed it. I watched it 5 times with my mom in the early 2000s. It was a great movie for myself then. But there is this one scene that is worthwhile. A ship sails into the harbor, and a boy stands upon the prow, a Viking boy, and the Vikings there at the harbor ignore him, and he stands there on the prow of that ship all day, and a stranger to that Viking culture asks, what are they doing? Why isn't he getting off the boat? And why aren't they talking to him? And they said, because they still wonder if he's a creature of the mist. He is standing still long enough for them to observe him. So what I would say, actually, if you're a man who's transitioning, you're realizing that you've just you've skipped your development and you're trying to develop, you're trying to find close connections with men who have already faced some of those places, who are initiated. One of the things to do is to not get very impatient, run away again. That's that uninitiated self. Instead, stand there, call them again. Hey, I know it didn't work out last week. Would you want to hang out again? I heard you guys have a fire circle. Can I come? And then you make that call. Persistence breaks down resistance. And you show up over and over and over until you prove you're solid. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love it. And, I instantly recognize how much further we could take that, and I would love to, but I'm also very aware of the time. And so, Rainier, I want to call it there. I will call it there. I don't really want to, but time is choosing that one for me. I want to thank you immensely for coming onto the show, sharing some of your insights and your beautiful stories. I feel like I know your daughter in part. And what I'd like to ask you lastly is, there might be a lot in this that sparks some curiosity, that sparks some confusion, and potentially, a desire to at least find out some more. So if someone were that way inclined, where could they find you?
Well, first, I need to say thank you, Mike, so much for having me on. And I know that I am a bit of a meandering soul in these moments, and I appreciate how very much you gently corralled and guided, and I love the entirety of the experience I got to share with you. And I think I also just want to thank your audience and just invite them to show up to life. Yeah, to just show up to the pleasures and the perils of life as it is, right? The beauty of the mosquito and the traffic and the argument and the beach and the forest and the sunrise and the sunset. All of it belongs. Everything belongs when we begin to take off those glasses and look at life as it is. So that's probably my final invitation. If you are a listener who's hearing this and wanting to step into that, you can find me, and most any day I'm over on Instagram at Rainier Wylde, and you'll have that, but Rainier Wylde on Instagram, and that will get you to my portal, which will take you to rainierwylde.com. You can find the link in my bio, but hang out with me on Instagram. Send me a DM there. I handle those myself and would love to talk with you and engage just a little further.
Beautiful. Thank you. We'll make sure all the specs are where they need to be. Rainier, thank you very much for joining us and sharing some of that beautiful wisdom and all those stories.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike.
You've been listening to the Everyday Legends podcast, the show dedicated to helping everyday men build legendary relationships with yourself, with your partners, and in your world. If you have got something from this podcast, please share it with someone that you think could benefit from it. And please visit your home for podcasts. Like us, subscribe to us, leave us a review. Your feedback is phenomenal in getting this in front of more eyes and ears. Until next time, I'm Mike Campbell, and remember to build that legendary integrity.